My name is Brenda Ice, and I serve as the TPE Planning Committee Chair for the 2020-2021 academic year. And I'm pleased to have you join us today for another series in our Jumpstart program. In my other life, I serve as the Assistant Dean and Director of Campus Life at Scripps College in Southern California. For our time today, I am privileged and honored to have Sean Chrysler join us and lead today's conversation about your articulating your value. And he'll spend some time going through the fundamentals of the career search, about your resume, cover letter, that elevator pitch, and all things that kind of prepare you for that next step in your journey of careers in student affairs. We will get started in just a bit, and I'll turn it over to Sean, but just a bit of housekeeping. We're going to ask that certainly if you feel inclined, you may keep your video up. That is absolutely okay, but we understand if you'd rather have your video muted, that's absolutely okay. We do ask that you do keep your microphone muted unless we prompt for a question for you, so as not to create interference during the presentation. There will be a time at the end of our session for you to ask questions where you can actually unmute yourself or put your questions in our chat box, and we'll be making note throughout the presentation to make sure that we ask them of Sean before we close out today. I've already, just as another note, this session is being recorded and will be made available through our subscription line, which we'll share with you following today's presentation. Lastly, Sean has agreed that he will modify his slides slightly for presentation and make them available to you as well at the conclusion of today's presentation. Without further ado, I do want to now turn it over to Sean Chrysler, who currently serves as the Assistant Vice President of Residence Life and Housing at SUNY Oswego in upstate New York. Sean, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to start off with this technical piece of just sharing my screen. So let me just pull that up so we can have that. All right. So everyone should be able to see that opening screen. Brenda, can you see that opening screen? Okay. Perfect. So I know we don't have a lot of time, so I want to kind of just jump right in. And so thank you for that introduction. So my name is Sean, and I use pronouns he, him, and his. And I want to share with you a little bit about myself as it relates to this conversation of articulating your value in the job search specifically. So this has been my professional area of focus for most of my professional career. And I work as a coach, where I work with professionals to not only improve their resume, cover letter, and their interviewing skills, but also their career trajectory as a whole. And so part of what originally led me here was as a graduate student, I found that as I was looking at my own experience and looking at the job search trajectory of others, that it just always seemed to me that some of my colleagues had a better way of telling their story and kind of their professional trajectory, if you will, during the interview process. And I realized that as I was telling my story, that it didn't always sound as good as it could. I always felt like I was leaving things out. And so my goal today is really to share what I think are some steps and some points that I'll ask that you reflect on so that you can have the best job search possible. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the objectives and again, what my goal is. So the goal is, again, to help participants reflect on how they add value to their position and the profession. It also is to provide you with some practical strategies as how to best articulate your value throughout the job process and stand out in all aspects of the job search. That's really important. And then my rationale is what I started with in my story, is that often strong candidates are just unable to properly showcase their value. That's where I started some years ago, or explain how their experiences would benefit the position to which they are applying. And so it's here that I want to start with some points that I think is really important. So when I spend time with candidates, the first thing I ask them about is reflection. And the reason I do is part of that is probably because of my positionality, uh, in that I believe that reflection through journaling and looking back is really how you find the focus for the future. And so I ask a lot of candidates to start there. And part of the reason is so many of us are running, trying to finish grad school, looking at the trajectory of our careers, working with family, that oftentimes we don't have the time to stop, or maybe even take the time to stop and look back at the path that we've created and what we've done. And so one of the cornerstones on some of the tips and pieces that I'm going to be sharing with you is that I will ask that you make time to reflect so you can use the practices that I'm going to share with you today. All right, so let's talk about those 4 practices that we're going to cover. Now, I'll admit, at times when I've done this before, it's typically an entire workshop, and in that workshop, I would normally share about 9 points, and I would spend that whole day with you and the whole group walking you through these pieces. But what I did was I condensed it, consolidated, and got it down to the 4 top points I want to make sure that you walk away with, so you're feeling good in terms of this job search. Here are the 4 points we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how to create the compelling story to help you articulate your value in the job search process. We're going to talk about knowing the interview as a means to articulating your value, preparing your references, and then we're going to talk about the cover letter and the resume kind of at the end. Okay. So let's start with my favorite. Create the compelling story. Now, this particular slide is really the slide that I use for departments when I'm helping them with their recruitment and interview process. And so I'm going to read some of this. You can't draw top talent if you don't believe in what the department and institution is doing, which is typically my message to departments, right? And that top talent and professionals need to see what the department and the institution is doing so they can be passionate about it and so that it's accessible. Oftentimes when I'm working with departments, I'll share with them the fact that the recruitment process is really a story. It's a story how the mission and the department and the institution come together to form a product, if you will, or an experience. And that story needs to be authentic, meaningful, and really capture the essence of what an institution and a department is doing or what they want to become. And so as you think about this piece, here's a question that I want to start off in the chat box. Here's what I want you to think about. What do you do to learn about a department or institution or a position that interests you? Okay. So what do you do to find out more information? I'm curious. And so in the chat box, tell us a little bit about what you do to find out more about an institution or department that you might be interested in. And let's see what others share. Yeah, read about their mission and values, go to their website. Sure. Student newspaper, that is a great one. Often, sometimes when you're in the job search, you forget the student newspaper. LinkedIn, one of my favorites. Informational interviews, can't go wrong there. Glassdoor, LinkedIn, reaching out to current employees. These are all great points when you're thinking about how you find out more information about an institution. So thank you for sharing. And this formula that I shared with you about the creating a compelling story, these pieces about it being authentic and meaningful, is the same formula that will begin and to help you share your story. And it's how we're going to begin the process. Because if you think about it, you are essentially not just a product, but you are the experiences and the decisions and all of those things right here in the real time moment. And so oftentimes when we think about that, this is how we show up to tell our story. But there's something always missing in the story that we tell, and that's the perspective of others. And so while you might hold the truth of your story, there are also others who hold the truth of your story and how they see you. Let me tell you a little bit about what I mean. Okay. So there are people around you that you have an impact on, right? And some of these people are in different areas. Some of these people that you have an impact on might be students, possibly supervisors, maybe peers and colleagues, your friends, definitely your references. And what about your mentors? All these are individuals who not only you invest in, but they invest in you. And more importantly, they hold a piece of how you can share your compelling story. So you don't have to create a compelling story alone, but you do have to recruit some people. And these are some of the people that you recruit. So let's get into the basis of how we begin this story, and where do we start. So I've identified you as a source of your story and articulating your value. Now I'm going to help you begin to articulate that story so you can pull the value out of it. Here's where we start. When you think about this piece, I want you to think about an interview, but the difference is I'm asking you to step out of yourself a little bit and to see you as others sees you. If I was doing theory to practice, we would be talking about Johari's window, right? What you can see, what you don't know, what you do know, and what you're not sure of, right? But in this piece, I'm asking you to just step out of yourself and to see yourself as others see you. And the best way you can do that is through this interview process. Okay. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to select some of the people on the left side of the screen, possibly students or peers or colleagues or references, and you're going to ask them a few questions. You're going to ask them, what would you want a hiring manager to know about me? You're going to ask, can you give me an example of how I use my strengths? Remember, this is from their perspective. Can you give me an example of how you have come to find value in my work? What was the impact for you, students, peers, and the department as you saw it? And then my favorite question, the fourth question is, would you work with me again and why? Right? And so as you think about this, these are people who can help us, because as we think about reputation, and people always say your reputation, your reputation, all it really is an amalgamation of the stories that have been shared about you. Now, some people, in terms when they're talking about you, they might say, well, I heard that Sean can jump over a building in a single bound, or I heard he saved a cat from a tree. And when they're talking about you, they may say things like, I heard that they were great with students, or I heard they were fun to work with. I heard they were authentic. I heard they were very creative. So as we start about this first part to creating a compelling story, the first part to articulating your value is working with the students, the supervisors, your friends, and your references to interview them, to step away from yourself, to understand how others see you, so you can then share these pieces in an interview process. My favorite piece about this strategy is it gets you to, if you watch reality TV show, I like watching Ayanla Fix My Life, and she uses this phrase, getting to the rock gut truth of things. This interview is not an easy interview. And so even though I'm talking about it and I'm smiling because I'm really excited to be with you today, this is a tough interview. So I don't want to kind of gaze over that. It's a tough interview because it requires courage. It requires courage to create a compelling story, because you're not only sharing the story of how you see you, but you're also pulling in examples and bits of how others see you too. And that's important, because this part is what's going to help us talk about the last part, or another part, which is creating your secret sauce in a cover letter. But in order to create the secret sauce, you have to get these pieces, you have to get these ingredients that only others have of you. So that's something to think about. Okay. All right. So let's stick with this theme of telling the compelling story. I want to stay here for a little bit. I want to talk about what I like to call our interview anchors. Interview anchors. And if you're not sure, let me share with you what I mean about an interview anchor. And this is what I share when I coach professionals and candidates about that. So, what are anchors in your story? Let me give you some examples. Student retention percentages, programs, working with faculty, advising students, maybe it's assessment, Maybe it's social justice, right? All of these things are what I like to call anchors. Now, they're different from passions. So there are a number of things you might be passionate about, but anchors keep you grounded in the interview process as it relates to how you share your story. So let me give you an example of that. When you think about the things that you do absolutely well, where do they fall? Is it assessment? Is it social justice? Is it advising with students? Perhaps you've been a advisor for the last 3 years. Perhaps you help a group bring a really large conference to your campus, or maybe you work in advising. Maybe you have the gift of gab, and maybe you see through students to see students, and you use that ability to advise them on their trajectory as a college student, which helps the university or college retain that student. So these anchors are not just passion areas, they're the things that make you you, that you're really good at. Okay. Let me give you some more example when I'm talking about anchors, because typically when I share these, I share them as a way to keep your answers with depth, with breadth, and with impact. And so as we get to that part when we're talking about answers, anchors really keep you focused on the pieces of your story, of your compelling story, so you don't get lost. And so when you tell it, and when you tell a story, others can follow you in the interview process. And more importantly, you can follow in the interview process. If you want to test this theory, if you've interviewed a candidate before, if you ever had a candidate that rambled, and I was a candidate that rambled, then you know you have a candidate that doesn't have that hasn't set themselves into the mental anchors to answer that question, because that's why they're rambling. Anchors keep you grounded in how to share your story and making sure that you don't get lost, but more importantly, those who are listening and interviewing you don't get lost as well. So let me share with you some of my anchors: supervision, leadership and management, operations, human resources, diversity inclusion, intercultural competence, financial planning, strategic planning, and last but definitely not least, developing and mentoring professionals in this. So when I talk about anchors, any question that you ask me, any question, doesn't matter. If you ask me to tell me a little bit about yourself, Sean. If you ask me, what's the hardest thing you've ever done in your work? Give me an example of a time where you had feedback. Give me an example where there was a time you had leadership. It's all going to come back to my compelling story. And in that compelling story, I'm going to leave you breadcrumbs to let you know a little bit about me. And those breadcrumbs are going to serve in the fact of, I'm going to tell you about my supervision as appropriate. I'm going to tell you about my thought about human resources. I'm going to tell you about my passion for financial planning. But more importantly, these are the things that all my answers are based on. Sean, how's your day? I'll bring it right back to supervision. Okay. So I just want you to have a sense of that before we kind of move forward. Okay. Creating a compelling story. Okay. Every institution and department has a story. What stories are they sharing, and what stories are others sharing about you? So I've shared the first step to create a compelling story. I've shared a little bit about the why and how as it relates to an interview. Now I'm going to share a little bit about the rationale and some of the pieces in that compelling story. Okay. So like all stories, there are some things that are happening. And so when I use this theme of stories, you're going to see me boil it down and bring it back large in a few ways. But what I'm talking about are some pieces there. So let me give you an example. So characters, connecting, motivation, obstacles, little climax, a twist, closing, and timing, right? These characteristics, if you will, are the mechanics of a great interview question. That's what these are. So when you're thinking about your interview questions, if you're struggling there to tell your story, then often this is where I probably would challenge the mechanics of how you answer that question. Because again, you only have a little bit of time, but in that question, in that answer, you get to tell me a little bit about the characters in that story, how you connect, why you're motivated, the obstacles, there's a little twist, and you're closing it. Oftentimes when I'm working with candidates, when you're telling your story, I want you to remember that this story is a small, concise story. Every answer that you give in an interview is a story. And I want you to practice or be able to practice to tell that story for that question in 1.5 to 2.5 minutes. Now, you might be thinking, Sean, that's just not enough time. I need more time. And all of you, or maybe some of you, have been in interviews where someone was asked a question and it took them 7 minutes to answer it. Now, as the interviewer, you're nervous because you're wondering if you can get to the next question. You have to be able to get it down to 1.5 to 2.5 minutes. And some of how you do that is practicing that story. For those of you who could be a little long-winded, like myself sometimes, this is something you're going to have to practice in the interview, because it's not about telling all the details, but it's about getting to those details to be able to tell your story. Okay, let's keep this piece moving. Some areas where you might already be telling your story. You might already be telling great stories about yourself on social media. Your resume is a great place to tell your story, so spend time with it. Your cover letter is probably my favorite place for you to tell your story, so spend time with it. And of course, the interview. So I want to get to the interview because I want you to know how I came up with that 1.5 to 2.5 minutes for your interview answer. Where did I get that math from? So let's talk about that. You have to know the interview. When you're going into the interview, you have to know the mechanics of an interview. And I'm sure some of you do. And so the interview is the most common selection device used in organizations. And so when you think about this interview, how I got to the 1.5 to 2.5 minutes is because I realized when I first was starting the interview process, I didn't really understand the interview, the interview process. And so what this means is that when I would have only 30 minutes to speak, I found myself only having answered maybe 2 or 3 questions when I knew the committee had more. And in the beginning, I wasn't very successful securing the first official interview after the phone interview because they couldn't see me in the stories that I was telling because my stories were too long. So let me give you some quick advice that you'll have to play with and test when you're going through the interview to know the interview. If you have a 30-minute interview, right? And I want you to use your hand if you're able, but if you have a 30-minute interview, I want you to think of it like this, okay? 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, okay? So the other 5 minutes in the interview, if it's a 30-minute interview, just count those away, okay? That's 5 minutes used for technology difficulties. That's 5 minutes used for introduction. Let those go, okay? And if you think about that, the last 5 minutes is going to be questions and closing. So now we're down to 20 minutes, okay? If we think about that 20 minutes, there can only be maybe 3 to 6 questions that they can ask. And if you then break that down, you will find that you need to be about 1.5 to 2.5 minutes to successfully share a compelling story in each of your interview answers so you can make it through the interview process. Okay. I won't go through structured interviews, but I just wanted to share that this is a common piece and you have to think about this. Okay. All right. When you think about interviews, here's something I want you to be going in the back of your mind about knowing the interview. Okay. So when we're talking about knowing the interview here, I'll put this example here and I'm give you an opportunity to read this question, but I'm also gonna read it with you. So this question is a structured interview question that says, tell me about a time when you were able to establish rapport with someone when the situation made it difficult to do so. What were the circumstances? What did you do? What were the results? Now, I'm showing you this question because it's really important in this understanding of the interview. Now, some institutions might just ask the first part, what made it difficult and what so, right? Another institution might follow up with what were the circumstances. Another one might follow up with what would you do. But because you're going to go to do a compelling story and you're going to be great at interviewing, you're going to already know, regardless of the question, there's always 2 or 3 questions that are not asked. Those 3 questions are here. What are the circumstances? What did you do and what were the results? Circumstances, What did you do in the results? Those are the secret questions behind any question you will be asked in an interview outside of the first question, which you already know is, tell me a little bit about yourself. Every other question after that, even if they ask you, tell me a little bit about your leadership, I want you to hone on in this. You still, in your compelling story, have to talk about the circumstances, what you did, and the results. And if you look below, I wanted you to see an example of an answer of questions and criteria that I have used to judge an answer given by a candidate. You'll see the first section talks about the low answer, where the interviewer just made some minimal attempts to understand the person's perspective, just a few. Maybe an okay answer, attempted to understand the other person's perspective, but you're going to be on the other end, because you're going to use some of the strategies where I'm sharing you, where you're going to remember, regardless of the question, whether they didn't ask it, you need to share circumstances, you need to share what you did, and you need to share the results. And that is where we get you into the effective answers, that you effectively reached out to the person, you actively sought out to understand the person's perspective, but more importantly, you developed an extremely positive relationship. Okay. So I want you to know the interview, because I want you to be thinking about the time, but more importantly, knowing the interview helps you articulate your compelling story. Okay. Here's a quick survey. Okay. And I want you to take a minute or so, and I'm gonna give you an opportunity to do this in the chat box. Okay. So quick survey. So if you are at an institution, you don't have to name your institution, but if you're in an institution that uses unstructured interviews, so at my institution, we ask some structured questions and allow for random generation of questions, you might put D in the chat box. If your department does semi-structured interviews, at my institution, we ask the same questions of each applicant and score answers using relevant scales, you might put in C. If at your institution or where you worked previously, they use structured interviews. So at my institution, our trained interviewers ask the same questions of each applicant and score answers using relevant rating scales. Or maybe A, highly structured interviews. At my institution, our trained interviewers ask questions based on thorough job analysis and the same questions of each applicant. So let me check out this chat box. Okay, I see a range. I see some of you are using a highly structured interview, a little bit of C and D, some are B. Okay. Now, when you think about this, I'll be really clear. I didn't use that to judge your institution or your department. I used it to give you a little bit more of the secret sauce. You have to go in understanding the type of interviews you may be subjected to. Now, I've been in institutions that use highly structured interviews. Now, those are my favorite because they allow you over time to get to candidates, their knowledge, skills, and ability faster. And it also allows you to use the job analysis. But more importantly, when it comes to having trained individuals who do the interviews, I know that I can trust that team to treat those candidates in an equitable manner. But you also have to be prepared for the unstructured interviews and be able to tell your compelling story there. Sometimes, even though they can be my favorite because they allow me to continue to tell different parts of my compelling story in an unstructured way. But you have to know the type of interviews you could be going into so you can tell the best story. All right, so I want to do a quick reflection. We talked about in the very beginning how to create a compelling story for those of you who might have joined us a little late. We started off with the compelling story, and that 1 minute snapshot, you remember, we started off by identifying key players, professionals, mentors, colleagues, students, others that had a different version of our truth. Then we went to the next part of the compelling story where we reminded ourselves that this was going to be hard, that this interview requires us to get to the rock gut truth of how others see us. And that can be scary because sometimes we don't always hear what we want, but we need that truth to be as authentic as we can in the interview process. But more importantly, we need that truth because we're going to take those examples that were given from us from references and mentors on the interview questions that we ask, and we're going to use those ingredients to create the secret sauce of what is our compelling story, our unique journey. Then we talked about the interview very quickly. We talked about the need to understand the math in terms of how you dissect a 30-minute interview to the 60-minute interview. We talked about needing to know if we are long-winded or if we're giving really short answers, because sometimes that's another issue. If you can only tell your compelling story in 30 seconds for every interview, and you're noticing that a 30-minute interview is ending 15 minutes after it started, they're not getting enough of you. Okay. They're not getting enough of you. So a really good story you should be able to tell in 1.5 to 2.5 minutes. And remember, when we're talking about story, we're shrinking it. The story is the answer to the interview question. So now I want to talk about some few other pieces, because I want to make sure that we have enough time at the end. All right. So let's move on. Let's talk about references, and I'm gonna spend a little time here, right? So creating a compelling story with your references, providing them with anchors, strengths, and areas of growth, examples that articulate value. Let me spend just a little time on references. So I can tell you that I've seen some really disturbing practices lately with professionals as it relates to professional references. So I've been subjected to it myself, where professionals will add me to their reference list. Maybe I worked with them a few years ago, maybe I still work with them now, but the point is they will add me without any knowledge that they have added me. And then what happens is I get an email from an employer saying, hey, I got this reference that I want you to do for fill in the blank. And I'm thinking to myself, was I a reference? I haven't spoken to that person in years. And then the person will text me. Maybe they'll text me and say, hey, I added you to my reference list. So let me give you a really strong word of caution. If you have not formally asked someone to be a reference, even if you know them, right? Even if you know them, you need to do that. That has to be an ask. Do not be a candidate that will add someone to their reference list, and you have not spoken to them. That is not a good way to share your story when you think about that. Now, more importantly, if you put someone on there, so for example, if you use me for reference and you think, well, his title is good, this should work, and they call me, because maybe I will go ahead and serve as a reference. The miss is going to be if I have great answers about you and great things to say, but they're for the wrong job. My perspective is possibly still of you when we worked together when you were at advising, or maybe my perspective of you is when we worked together when you were RD, or maybe my perspective of you is when I watched you lead that NCUR delegation. So I have great answers, but my perspective is wrong because you didn't call me, and when you didn't call me, you didn't give us an opportunity to create a compelling story together about how we would share that truth about you. You didn't give me an opportunity about some of those anchors that we talked about before that I needed to remember and needed to recall when I'm talking about you. You didn't give me an opportunity to remember how great you were with students, how supportive you were, how good you were at retaining students, the great social justice initiative. I forgot. So you lost the opportunity to have a great, compelling story. And more importantly, we missed the opportunity for me to refresh myself on how valuable I see you. So the moral of that is you have to work with your references. Every reference is just about the same. Some of them are different, but let's be candid. They ask the basic questions. What are they? You already know them. How long have you known them? What context have you known them? Describe their leadership, conflict ability, people skills, management, problem solving, critical thinking. And the last but not least, my favorite is, will you work with them again? So preparing your references, just like the first group, if you think about that interview or telling your story, is really important. I do not let, even as an AVP, if I put you down as a reference, there's a phone call that happens with that reference. I ask, can you be my reference? You say yes. I set up an hour phone call. We walk through my resume, we walk through my cover letter, and then I begin to talk to you about some really important things. What examples will you share? What do you see as my strengths? What do you see as my areas of opportunity? They're going to ask that question. What's Sean's areas of opportunity? You want that person to be truthful, but you also want to understand a little bit better of what that is. And so I just wanted to walk you through that just a little bit. You have to prepare your references to articulate your value. Okay. I want to jump to the cover letter in this last piece, and I want to spend some time. So if you remember, if we reflect back, we talked about reflection, we reflect back, what are the anchors in your story? Now, your story might be about student retention and percentage. And I gave an example. It might be programs, working with faculty, live-in faculty, advising students that grade and occur, RHA delegation, assessment, your ability, because that's what assessment is. Let's be honest. Assessment is the ability to tell the story with qualitative and quantitative data. Mixed methods too, right? It's the ability to do that. Or perhaps it's social justice. I shared what my anchors were, right? And when I share my anchors, I share with you that any answer you ask me is going to be based in the anchors that I think are important for you to see. So if you ask me a question, now mind you, when I'm talking about these anchors, and so I don't want to forget this because in a longer session, I would spend a lot more time dissecting this. So I don't want to forget this. You don't have to use all 8 anchors all the time. Okay. So depending on the job and the interview, I'm not going to use all 8 of these anchors because they might not be relevant. But depending on the job, I might find that supervision is something that I need to talk about. I need to talk about supervision. And let me pull this anchor for human resources because they talked a little bit about that in the job description. And okay, I'm working with faculty. Let me pull that anchor as I'm working with faculty. And so you won't use all the anchors that ground you in sharing your story. You will only use the ones that make you more effective in selling that story or sharing that story, I should say. And so I might not talk about leadership and management. I might not talk about operations. I might not talk about that. And so that's okay. Okay. Now, here is a word of that I want you to think about. Diversity, inclusion, and intercultural competence. And I want to be really clear about this next piece I want to share. If you are a person of color, or perhaps you have a identity that might be hidden from view where one could readily see it, there is no one, I repeat, in our field, there is no one in the field of higher education and student affairs that will get past the tell me a little bit about diversity and inclusion or intercultural competence or social justice as it relates to the work you're doing currently or the work that you're doing in the past. Okay. So there is no ability to just say what comes to mind. Okay. You have to reflect on this question. Okay. You have to think about this question in a different way. When I told you earlier, there were always hidden questions behind the question. I don't care what the question is. If it's about diversity, inclusion, and social justice, let me clear this up for you. This is the question you should really be asking yourself, because this is the question that's being asked, whether you know it or not. The question is this: how competent are you as a leader in your ability to create inclusive campus environments that support the retention and success of the full range of people on your campus? I'm going to say it one more time. How competent are you as a leader in your ability to create inclusive campus environments that support the retention and success of the full range of people on your campus? That's how I want you to think about the question. If you think about that question and your answer is short, or it says something like, I had a candidate say to me, I read the anti-racist book by Dr. Ingram, or I just finished White Fragility. If that is the context of your answer, you got some work to do. Because we got to go back to that reflection. So I want you to think about that, because that is the answer that is really being asked there. So remember that. Okay. So I want to switch gears just a little bit as we're moving forward in this, and I want to continue to talk about this secret sauce as we continue to articulate our value in this process. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about this, right? You see Fuddruckers and Steak and Shake. Hopefully things are starting to come to mind. Okay. Cheeseburger Paradise, White Castle's one of my favorite. Culver's, Wimpy, Hardee's, Wendy's, if you have these in your area. And some of these might not be in your area as they appear. right? Some of them are national, some of them are more regional. Maybe you have a Five Guys, maybe you have a Red Robin, Fat Burger from our West Coast folks, right? Ruby's, right? Royal Castle, In and Out, right? So these are just some of the places. But here's what I want you to think about. There are 35,000 restaurants just in the US. We're just talking about the US. There are 35,000 restaurants that sell hamburgers. Now we just talking about beef, right? Just a hamburger patty. There are 35,000 of them. These aren't even all of the franchises that sell hamburgers, right? But there are 35,000 restaurants. Actually, I'm sorry, I thought in the US, it's actually in the world when I think back to my numbers that sell hamburgers. Just a hamburger. But think about this, right? Everybody in their commercial is sharing with you their compelling story. If I was using the Coming to America verbiage, if you've seen that movie, you remember McDowell's. McDowell's was selling a comparative story, right? Talking about the special sauce, no all beef patty, right? And the difference was they didn't use sesame seed buns, right? That was the difference between McDowell and McDonald's. And so when we think about this secret sauce, all of you in your cover letter have the ability to stand out and articulate your value. This is where you do it. You're not like other candidates, you're different. And so this is an opportunity to think a little bit about that. Okay. As I kind of close it down a little bit, I want to talk about the cover letter and I want to give a really quick example. Now, this is an example that I pulled from a cover letter for when I was applying and working for semester C. And I want you to see that this paragraph, and again, I'll share these slides with you, holds one compelling paragraph to show one story. In it, I start off with my objective in terms of what I was trying to do in this compelling story, which was to support the student life team. You'll see in my answer, I'll move to talk about the need of this position and how I work through the objectives to work with the shipboard community, right? Then I'll move to talking about my knowledge, skills, and abilities as they relate to this position. And then I'll begin to close out with my idea as it relates to servant leadership and what the results were. This is one paragraph. It's one story with two stories embedded in it. And I'm going to share that with you, but I want you to think hard about your cover letter because it is important. So just to close it out, we've covered four important areas: creating a compelling story, knowing the interview, preparing your references, and the cover letter. And we've talked about our goals. And the purpose of this session was to provide you with the opportunity to increase your knowledge in these areas. And I wanted to make sure we were able to do that.
Sean, it is impossible to do a mic drop in a Zoom meeting, but I just want to tell you how pleased I am with the content of which you provided.
Thank you.
I myself took my own notes, and I've been in the game for a while, but there's always an opportunity to learn from colleagues, and I truly appreciate what you have
Thank you, Brenda.
shared with this group.
Thank you.
There have been questions in the
Sure.
chat, and I've done my best to kind of paraphrase and bring a few of them together for
Sure,
you.
of course.
And so one of the questions that I had initially was going to ask you, and it's come up in the chat, is the tell me about yourself question.
Mhm.
And folks are interested in wanting to know what key elements go in it. Is it meant to be a rehash or a quick summary of your resume? Are you talking off script? What advice would you give someone when prompted? Tell me about yourself.
Yeah, tell me about yourself. Is one of my favorite questions, not because you tell about yourself. And I've seen a few different strategies. So I've seen some candidates start all the way from, I'm originally from Chicago. This is how I got to Tennessee, right? So I've seen that strategy. I've seen, my name is Sean. I'm really interested in, figure skating and other things. And then I've seen the third. The third is probably my favorite because the third is this mix between scripted and unscripted. And really how you frame that is what's called WIFM. It's WIIIFM, which means what's in it for me. That's what the interviewer is thinking. What is in this question that I can use? And so when you talk about telling about yourself, there should be some key objectives. You should be telling about yourself as it relates to that compelling story. And so that story might start with a quick example of how you believe in student retention, how you've done to help that in your department, and why you feel like this job aligns with where you're going next. And so it's a really little story, but it should always end with why you're interviewing for that job and what's in it for them.
Perfect. Thank you. Folks are asking for you to reshare some of these nuggets in the chat. I have notified them that you plan to modify your presentation slightly so they can get
Sure.
these items. One particular one, before I forget, is the DI question you asked. If you could put that in the chat for them so that they can better
Sure.
understand what it is they're actually being asked. And while you're doing that, another question that's come up, and we know that this tends to be one of those screening questions about what are your weaknesses? Tell me about your challenge points. So can you talk about how you address this without completely disqualifying yourself from the process?
Yeah, I think the first part, and I'm listening, I'm just as I'm talking, I'm just looking for, because I want to put that question in there. But you have to own it. And I think if you use the first strategy of talking to your mentors, your references, and your students, you will actually be able to give an answer that's shareable. So for example, if they tell you that Brenda, you're really passionate about this, but sometimes you lose the details, or you're really passionate about this. Sometimes you get to bring this together. You get to share that authentically, because you also get to share what you're doing to fix it. So for example, I will tell in the interview, email sometimes is a struggle for me if I'm working with students, because I get really passionate at putting out those fires with parents, and then I continue. And so what I have done is, and I fill in the blank, right? And so I'm going to share with you my areas of opportunities because I have them, but you're also going to know you're dealing with someone who's identified them, give an example, and has come up with a strategy on how I'm working through it.
Nice, very nice. One of the components of your presentation was talking about the interview mechanics and kind of knowing the structure of the interview before you go in. What advice would you give this group about when to ask those types of questions so that you better understand how long the interview is, the types of how many questions will be asked? Like, when is the appropriate time to gather the mechanics so that you can appropriately prepare?
Yeah, so when you're getting ready for the interview, there are no bad questions. You get to ask, and they won't tell you, of course, what the questions are, but you get to say, Miss Brenda, I'm getting ready for this interview. I just wanted to know. I know it's 30 minutes. I want to be ready. Can you give me a simple frame of what the interview is? Right now, it's always an opening and a closing, right? So they might say it's an opening and closing, and we're just gonna ask you a few questions, okay? And if they say that, then you get to kind of step back away, knowing that it's 30 minutes is probably a structured interview, right? Because they only have a certain time. It's only when you get to 60-minute interview where you probably are open to an unstructured interview. But typically a 30-minute interview, because they only have 30 minutes and they have to share those results, there's only 3 to 5 questions. So a longer interview is typically, it can be unstructured. It's not always, but it can be.
Perfect. So more times than not, we apply for jobs and we know that we can check off most of the requirements that you can meet those and you have the experience. But oftentimes we're encouraged to apply for jobs even if we don't have the full cadre of everything. So how would you address your deficits in a way that is meaningful? Should you be the one to out yourself to say, I don't have supervision, or do you wait for them to tell you, I don't see supervision on your resume?
Yeah. Oh wow. That's a tricky question. I'm gonna do my best in answering that. So first of all, this is when my equity hat jumps on a little bit. So first of all, I wanna share with you real quick that even in the literature, right, when we talk about interviewing, those who might identify themselves as male or female will see that part very differently. And so I'm gonna just center myself for a second and say, as a male, I feel really confident in applying for jobs that I always don't have the experience in. I run head on. in it. I'll apply. They'll say, I need a doctorate. I'm like, I almost got it. And I'll still apply, right? Now, I'm just bringing you into my life. Now, my partner or my wife, for example, I have to coach and push her every time she looks for a job, even though she's credentialed, to apply for jobs that seem like a stretch. Okay. Because within her ways of knowing, she doesn't have it, why apply? Right. And so you don't want to set yourself up. But here's what you do want to do. If you're looking at something that you're missing, let's say they're looking for supervision, what you want to do in that cover letter is you still have to articulate your philosophy of supervision, right? We at least have to know that you have a sense of supervision. Everybody started off as not being a supervisor until you become a supervisor. And so if you can share your philosophy of supervision, if you've thought about that, and you can juxtapose what you would do as a supervisor, having not been one, and what you've done in leadership, typically that marriage will allow them to see that you are ready for supervision.
Nice, nice. Thank you, thank you. So a very specific question, and it's around being asked a question and wanting to know what's the appropriate pause length before you actually answer. Should there be a pause? Should you recite the question again just to kind of gather your thoughts? What's your take on that?
Yeah, sure. Here's what I'll say. And again, I realize that the answer that I'm about to give has some gendering to it, right? In my mind, what I want to say to all of you is that I want you to own the interview. I don't want you to control it. I don't want you to take it over, but I do want you to own it because it is yours. It's not something that is happening to you. It is something that is happening with you. It is an experience that you're doing together. And so if I can just situate it there, what I would say is that when I am asked a question and when you're asked a question that you don't understand, you get to take a deep breath and say, I think I heard you, but I can you say that last part for me? And if you're asked a question and you need a minute to think, now I will say, if you walk back through some of the pieces where we talked about anchoring, you probably won't have to think too long because you already know where your answers are coming from. You're not pulling them from here and there. You're pulling them from 3 or 4 places. But I do think it's appropriate if you're asked a question and you need a second, just say, I just need a minute. Take a sip of water, take a deep breath, gather your thoughts, right? Your compelling story, and then share out.
There's some inquiry about references, and I know you spent a great deal of time talking about prepping references and what have you. When do you reach out to references? Is it only at the start of your interview process? Do you wait until you know you're a viable candidate? How much prep time should you be giving your references as part of this process?
Yeah, sure. So, depending on the let's say let's measure that based on the access to your references, right? And so I'll just use my really quick for example. So now at the AVP level, most of my references are either other vice presidents or presidents and some students, and students can be busy too. And so I reach out to them far before I need them, because before I need them to be a reference, I actually need an hour on their schedule to walk them through what we're going to share, right? Because that's not something that I want them sharing until we talk about it. I want them to know, get a quick update from me. I want them to understand my new strengths, my new abilities. And more importantly than anything, I want us to be on the same page about what I need them to share. Depending on the job, I might really need them to talk about my leadership skills, or depending on the job, I might really need them to talk about my ability to be compassionate and empathetic to the student experience. But what one reference might share, I might not necessarily need another reference to share. And so that's where that strategy comes in a little bit, where reference A may do a really great job at showing and talking about these things. It's okay for this reference to maybe bring in these pieces so they could, again, because you don't hold the whole truth, right? So you're pulling these references in to show the best portrait of you, authentic portrait of you.
And then we have time for one more. And so I think it's one that, while only asked by one, I think is something that everyone is curious about. It's that inevitable question when the interview ends and they ask, what questions do you have for us? And so we know that it could be very specific based off the institution, but generally, what themes should people be considering when they develop these types of questions for the interview process.
Yeah, so I think with that, again, that's one of those ones that I think can fall into three quick buckets. Sometimes you get candidates that want to ask you, I'm sorry, sometimes you get candidates that want to ask you a question that is so high level, it's beyond the position. I remember I used to have candidates that would ask me about some statements that the president made, and I would be thinking, I don't know, and I haven't read them either, right? And so there's these high level, they ask me about the strategic plan. I get some candidates who've asked me about the department or the area in which they work, and they're very straightforward. And then I get some candidates who might not know what to ask. If you don't know what to ask, I would lead you back to the questions that anchored you and why you apply for the job. That's what you might ask about. So for me, if I didn't have a question, I'd say, talk to me a little bit about supervision. What's the climate in the department? How do people feel? How do you all assess that? So even if I don't have a question, I'm going to ask you a question about what anchors me in the very questions that I gave you. And so that's what you want to do. You do want to be able to ask those questions, because remember, it's not something that's happening to you, it's something that's happening with you. And part of the human experience is curiosity.
Thank you so very much. I do appreciate your time today. And while everyone might be muted, I can tell just based off the chat and some of the facial expressions that people were very engaged and found your nuggets of wisdom, just what they needed to kind of kickstart their search process. So again, on
Sure.
behalf of TPE, Sean, I want to thank you sincerely for your time today. For members of the audience, know that this has been recorded and we'll make it available to you in the coming days following the workshop, as well as working with Sean for him to modify his slides slightly, and then we can also make those available to you so you can use that as you prepare for your search.
And I
As
left
a
my contact information too, Brenda, at the end, so folks can
fantastic.
contact me.
Fantastic. And then as a reminder, we are still in our Jumpstart series. And so next week will be our final session where we will actually talk about gathering all of this information that now you've collected over these 3 weeks and making sense of all of this information to actually move you through the next portion of your search process. So we're hopeful that you can join us again next Thursday, same time. Make sure that you register for it. And we certainly appreciate your time today and wanting to be a part of our TPE workshops and experiences. Thank you again to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, evening, afternoons, and weekends, and we'll do this again next week. Thank you again, Sean. Take care, everyone.